It is deep winter in the forests east of Oslo, and a hunting party is moving through the snow with rifles, radios, and a license. They are tracking a wolf pack. Not one problem animal that killed a dog last week, the whole pack, a family group that has denned and hunted this patch of forest, and the plan, signed and approved by the state, is to remove all of them. The snow makes it possible. You can read a pack's whole night in the tracks, count the animals, follow them to where they are resting. And somewhere ahead of these hunters is a wolf that belongs to one of the smallest populations of large predators anywhere in the developed world. Because here is the thing about Norway and its wolves. There are almost none of them. On the most recent count, the entire country holds somewhere in the region of 55 to 58 wolves, and only about 34 to 36 of those live wholly inside Norway, with the rest padding back and forth across the long forested border with Sweden. That is not 55,000. It is not 5,500. It is 55 animals, give or take, in a country the size of the whole British Isles. You could fit Norway's entire wolf population into a couple of school buses, and the counting itself is almost comically precise. Norway tracks these animals through the winter snow so carefully that its official figures come in fractions, half a litter here, a border pack that only half belongs to the country there. This is a nation that knows very nearly every individual wolf inside its borders by territory and by family group. It is not managing some faceless gray mass of predators pouring over the hills. It is managing a population small enough to name. And every winter, this nature-loving, deeply green, extravagantly wealthy country licenses the killing of a large slice of them. In several recent seasons, the approved quota has crept up toward roughly half of every wolf the government had just finished counting. Whole packs, named and mapped, marked for elimination. So, the obvious question, the one that makes people furious before they understand the answer, is why? Why would a country that has so few wolves, that spent real effort getting them back, turn around and hunt them down to the edge on purpose, by official policy, year after year? And the answer is not simple cruelty. It is a story about sheep, about a line drawn through a map, and about a bargain struck in Parliament that decided in advance exactly how much wildness Norway was willing to tolerate. So, let's get into it. Because the wolf is the trigger here, the real story is the compromise. Start with how close these wolves came to never existing at all, because it changes how you hear everything after. Norway used to have wolves, plenty of them, and then it did what most of Europe did. It hunted and bountied and poisoned them until they were gone. By the middle of the 20th century, the wolf was, for all practical purposes, wiped out of Scandinavia entirely. Not rare, gone. And it stayed gone for years, until a tiny number of wolves wandered back in from the huge Finnish and Russian population to the east, re-established themselves in the forests along the Norway and Sweden border, and began, against considerable odds, to breed. The entire Scandinavian wolf population alive today traces back to just a handful of founding animals. It is one of the most inbred wolf populations on Earth, a whole lineage squeezed through the eye of a needle, hanging on in the woods of a region that had already erased it once. To put a number on how narrow that thread really is, geneticists have traced the whole Scandinavian population back to only a few founding wolves, a group you could count on one hand, that arrived and bred in near total isolation from the rest of the species. That is a genetic bottleneck so tight it carries real biological consequences, the kind of deep inbreeding that eventually shows up in smaller litters and long-term health problems. This is not a robust wild population comfortably riding out the centuries. It is a small, closely related family tree rebuilt from almost nothing, and everyone who manages it knows exactly how thin the founding stock was. So the wolves you are looking at are not some ancient stable wilderness holdover. They are a fragile comeback, a second chance that arrived on its own 4 feet. And Norway's response to that second chance was to build a very careful, very Norwegian system for keeping it small. The centerpiece of that system is a number, and the number is startling once you understand what it means. Norway sets a national population target for wolves of 4 to 6 litters per year, with at least 3 of those born inside Norway itself. Now, you might reasonably hear the phrase population target and assume it is a floor, a minimum the country is trying to protect and grow toward. It is not. It functions as a ceiling. It is the most wildness the system is designed to allow. When the wolves breed above that line, the state steps in to bring them back down. The target is not there to make sure Norway has enough wolves. It is there to make sure Norway never has too many, and the entire apparatus of licensed winter hunting exists to hold the population against that ceiling, year after year. The other half of the system is a line on a map, Norway has designated a wolf zone, a strip of territory where wolves are officially allowed to live and breed, and that zone covers only around 5% of the country. Inside it, wolves are tolerated, more or less. Outside it, across the other 95% of Norway, a wolf is essentially not permitted to settle at all, and one that tries can be removed. So the country did not simply decide how many wolves it would keep. It decided precisely where they were allowed to exist, and drew a border around a small corner of the map and said, "Here, and nowhere else." And none of that appeared out of thin air. It was forged in a specific and genuinely bitter fight. When the wolves came back and began denning near farming districts, the sheep started turning up dead, sometimes many from a single flock, and rural Norway did not react calmly. There were furious public meetings, there were threats, there were wolves shot illegally by people who were finished waiting for anyone's permission, and there was a deep sense across parts of the countryside that distant city voters and European treaties were forcing a dangerous predator onto the communities that would pay every cost of having it. Out of all that anger came the deal. Parliament sat down and negotiated the wolf zone and the low target as a kind of peace treaty between two Norways, a way to keep some wolves on the map without asking the farming districts to live surrounded by them. What you are actually looking at, then, is not really a wildlife plan. It is a truce with fur on it. To understand why that truce felt necessary, you have to leave the forest and walk out into a Norwegian summer pasture, because that is where the real pressure comes from, and the reasons behind it come in three parts, escalating. The first reason is livestock, and it is genuinely serious, and it is the peace that makes this whole thing defensible rather than simply spiteful. Norway practices a style of sheep farming that is close to unique in the modern world. Every summer, around 2 million sheep are released to graze freely across the forests and the mountains, unfenced, unguarded, roaming the open landscape for months. It is a centuries-old practice woven deep into rural Norwegian life. And it means that when a predator returns to that landscape, there is essentially nothing standing between it and an enormous, slow, undefended food supply spread across the whole countryside. Wolves kill sheep. So do bears and lynx and wolverines, all of which Norway also manages with the rifle. For a farmer who turns his flock loose in June and goes looking for them in autumn, a wolf in the district is not an abstraction. It is a real threat to a real livelihood, on top of an old and very human fear of the animal itself. That fear and that loss are not invented, and a government that ignored them entirely would not be telling the truth about the countryside. And to its credit, Norway does not simply shrug at the wolf's victims. It runs one of the most generous predator compensation systems anywhere in the world, paying farmers for the livestock they lose to wolves and bears and lynx and wolverines, tens of thousands of animals compensated in a bad year. So this is not a country that pretends the damage is imaginary or expects farmers to just quietly absorb it. It pays out and it manages, and it still decided that the sheer number of wolves itself had to be held down, which quietly tells you the killing was never only about the balance sheet of dead sheep. It is also about how much wildness the country is willing to have in the room at all. That is the first pillar, and it is solid. And it is only the start. If you are enjoying watching a wildlife story quietly turn into a story about parliamentary arithmetic and sheep subsidies, you should subscribe, because this channel does almost nothing else. It goes deep on exactly these stories, where the headline is an animal on the brink and the answer underneath is a negotiated number in a committee room. Because the second reason is the one that reframes the whole thing. The second reason is that, from the state's point of view, these wolves are not actually as endangered as the raw count makes them sound. And that single idea is doing an enormous amount of the work. Yes, there are only around 55 wolves in Norway, but Norway does not treat them as a separate Norwegian population. It treats them as the western edge of a larger Scandinavian population shared with Sweden, which in turn connects distantly to the vast wolf populations running across Finland and Russia and beyond. Seen through that lens, the argument goes, killing a big share of Norway's wolves is not driving a species toward extinction. It is trimming the local edge of something larger that will persist regardless. This is why the target can be a ceiling instead of a floor. The policy is not asking whether Norway has enough wolves to be safe. It has quietly decided that question is Sweden's problem and Finland's and Russia's, and that Norway's job is simply to hold its own small corner down to an agreed number. It is a political quota wearing the costume of species management. Sit with that, because it is the hinge the entire system turns on. The wolves are not being saved to a minimum, they are being held to a maximum, and the maximum was set by negotiation, not by biology. Which brings us to the third reason, or really the third and hardest truth, which is what that negotiation actually produced. Norway's wolf policy is the child of a political compromise, hammered out in parliament between two Norways that do not agree. Urban Norway broadly wants wolves, likes the idea of a wild country, and votes accordingly. Rural Norway broadly lives with the sheep and the fear and the losses, and wants the wolf gone. The wolf zone and the low target are the treaty line between those two camps, a deal that lets the cities keep a token population in a small designated box, while the countryside gets to keep almost the entire rest of the map wolf-free. And the brutal thing about that deal is what it authorizes in practice. It means the state will license hunters to go into the forest in winter and eliminate entire family groups, sometimes packs living inside the very zone that was supposed to be their refuge. Because even inside the box, the numbers are only ever allowed to reach that ceiling and no higher. A country that clawed its wolves back from total extinction now spends its winters carefully machining the population back down, whole families at a time, to a number a committee agreed on. Not because the wolves are thriving, precisely because they are not allowed to. And the timing of all this is what makes it land right now, because the ground is shifting under the wolf across the whole continent at once. For decades, the wolf was strictly protected under European conservation law, the highest tier of safeguarding. Then, very recently, that changed. The Bern Convention, the big European wildlife treaty, voted to downgrade the wolf from strictly protected to merely protected, a change that came into force in 2025, and the European Union moved to loosen its own rules to match. The official reasoning is that wolves have recovered enough across parts of Europe to be managed more aggressively. Whatever you make of that, the practical effect is a green light. Across Europe, wolves just got easier to kill. Legally, at the exact moment the pressure to kill them was already high. Norway is not even a member of the European Union, so it was never strictly bound by all of this to begin with, and it has long been one of the most aggressive wolf managers on the continent regardless. But the downgrade still matters, as a signal. It tells every government in Europe that the political wind has turned, that the long era of treating the wolf as essentially untouchable is ending, and that a country which wants to hold its predators down will now find far fewer people and far fewer treaties standing in the way. And here is the part that makes Norway's version of it sting. In that very same window, Norway counted its wolves and found something it had not seen in over a decade. For the first time in 11 years, the number of wolf litters born had fallen below the country's own minimum target. The population that the system is supposed to hold between 4 and 6 litters had slipped under the floor of its own range, down to around 3.5 litters, with the total number of animals dropping from the winter before. So the machine built to stop there being too many wolves was still running, still licensing hunts, still pushing down, in a year when, by its own official yardstick, there were suddenly too few. The ceiling had become a trapdoor, and nobody had quite decided to stop standing on it. So it goes, winter after winter, in the snowy forests east of Oslo and along the Swedish border, and every season the stakes get a little sharper. The wolves den and breed and rebuild in their small allowed corner. The count comes in, the quota is set. The hunters go out with their licenses and their radios and their perfect tracking snow, and a share of the 50-odd wolves in the entire country is removed to hold the line at the agreed number. Some winters it is a handful. Some winters it is close to half of everything that was counted. And every winter it happens to one of the most fragile, most inbred, most improbable predator populations left in Europe, an animal that came back from nothing and is being kept deliberately, permanently, at almost nothing. The wolf that walked back into Scandinavia on its own 4 feet did something genuinely remarkable. It undid its own extinction. It found a way back into a landscape that had spent a century trying to be rid of it, and it started families in the cold border forests against every reasonable expectation. And a modern, gentle, prosperous democracy looked at that comeback, weighed it against 2 million wandering sheep and the votes of the countryside, and decided in writing exactly how much of it to permit. Not none. Norway is not trying to erase the wolf again, but not much either. 4 to 6 litters, 5% of the map. A couple of school buses of wolves for an entire nation, held right there on the line by rifle every single winter because that is the number the paperwork agreed to.